Hi. I love you. Hey. So how do we combat the leftist hypocrisy? For example, like Antifa using fascist tactics, like burning books and trying to erase historical names of schools and museums.
I think pointing it out and laughing at them is usually the best tactic, and it's worked pretty well. I mean, even Bernie Sanders has been forced to disown Antifa. Even a bunch of people on the left have been forced to walk away from sort of the more extreme versions of the left. They've done more damage than they know. These idiots on college campuses who are rioting and trying to beat people up because Charles Murray is speaking at Middlebury, these people have done super damage to the far left cause. So more of that, please. Like more of them exposing what they are is a better thing.
Hi. I'm very, very libertarian, and I want to quickly thank you for convincing me not just to advocate for liberty, but also the truth. And you mentioned a lot on your podcast increasing military.
Yes.
You talk about, and you just talked about how the future of conservatism is conservatarianism, which I agree with, but I haven't heard a convincing argument for increasing our military.
Okay, so the argument for increasing the military is that if we don't fill that gap, somebody else who's adversarial to our interests will, and then they will use that power in order to harm us and harm freedom on a global scale. So libertarians would like to see freer trade, for example. What has made the world free for trade is the presence of the American military. What made Europe free for trade and not behind the Iron Curtain was World War II and the Marshall Plan and the growth of the military and the fact that we shut down the Soviet Union and essentially forced them to collapse. That was an after effect not of trade, but actually of the American military being present and all of Europe being reliant on that. The American military is what makes the world safe for the increase in freedom, which increases trade, which increases jobs, which increases liberty at home. Now, am I concerned that we spend too much on the military sometimes? Sure, because we should always make sure that we're only spending what we need to spend on anything. But there are two versions of libertarians. There's sort of the Rand Paul small military version of libertarianism, and then there's a more kind of Larry Elder version of libertarianism, which is a strong military, hawkish version of libertarianism. This is not really a question of principle so much as it is a question of tactic. So do you think that America is made more free and the world is made more free by America withdrawing within its own borders and spending less on the military? Or do you think that America is made more free by a strong, powerful American military, for example, guaranteeing the freedom of the South China Sea so that China doesn't form a regional trade bloc adversarial to our interests and shut us out? Right? That'd be a good example.
Hey, Ben, you started alluding to natural law theory, and I had a question. Do you think that new natural law and its theorists like Robert P. George and Michael Pekalik, do you think that they're going to lose the argument without applying religion into it? Because I was thinking that might be better for leftists that want religion out of everything.
Well, I think that most of the great original natural law theorists like John Locke were not shy about invoking the roots of Judeo-Christian civilization as background for the natural law theory that they promulgated. This has always been sort of an argument, and it's a really fascinating one, between the conservative positivists and legal positivists who basically say that rights exist because of the Bible and because of Judeo-Christian civilization, and people who think that they are discoverable in the universe. I would suggest, I come down on the side that says that it's very difficult to argue that all rights are discoverable just from the nature of things. It is possible that there's a right answer and a wrong answer, but it's hard to prove it. It's just hard to prove it in an argument. It's hard to prove that your version of reality is superior to the opposite side's version of reality just by appealing to nature, because nature is basically indifferent. I may think I'm right. I may think that my version of my interpretation of nature is the best, but it's very hard to argue it. Now, we are at one advantage in terms of the natural law theorists like Robert George, which is that most people, even on the left, assume most of the basic premises that Robert George assumes, right? They assume that individual life is worth something, for example. They assume that individual human rights are something worth fighting for. They just define individual human rights differently. So they're still working within the same framework that Robert George is. But I think that it's a complex question, a good one. I think that it's important to distinguish between intellectual conversations that you're having with other natural rights theorists and how you teach people on a basic level about what is right and wrong. Because I don't know that a natural rights theory can long last in a country that does not have biblical grounding. Let's put it that way. I think you have to have a Judeo-Christian society in order to accept the basic fundamental premises of natural law mainly because the basic fundamental premises of natural law were based in that society originally.
Hi, Ben. Over here.
Sorry.
Well, it doesn't help
There
if
you
I
go.
speak into a mic, does it? My name's Olivia. Thanks for coming. I have a question for you regarding the hearing on Russell Vought and Senator Bernie Sanders and how that involves with people of convicting faiths.
So I'm actually not familiar with what you're talking about, so say it one more time.
So Russell Vought was a potential deputy financial director.
Oh, yes, sorry. I'm sorry. Yes. So Bernie Sanders basically ripped the guy because he was a Christian, not because he'd actually used his Christianity in any way when it came to his job. Yeah, I mean, it shows the radical intolerance that the left has for religion. Radical intolerance the left has for religion. It's one of the reasons why I'm libertarian on the issue of marriage. I'm not libertarian on the issue of marriage because I believe in same-sex marriage on a personal level. I'm a religious guy. I don't. Right? But I'm libertarian on same-sex marriage because I know that what's coming next is that the left is going to use same-sex marriage as a club to beat the living hell out of religious people. They're going to shut down religious schools. They're going to take away tax-free status from churches. They're going to destroy religious homes. I mean, you see there was a piece of legislation that was just passed in Ontario that allows the government to remove children from homes if the parents don't approve of the transitioning of their own children. I mean, this is where the left is going to go, and Bernie Sanders is a part of that. It's horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying.
Hi, Ben. Over here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm from Montana, and with our most recent election, thank you, whoever that was. Hi.
The one dude from Montana. Whoop, okay.
Yeah, there's two of us here. What Gianforte did, and for those of you who don't know, he body slammed a reporter, which, please don't do that. It's really taken it, conservatism in Montana has really taken a hit. How do we go about turning that back around?
Okay, so I think, number one, Gianforte did the right thing by coming out, acknowledging his mistake, and apologizing for it, obviously. That whole incident was very disturbing to me, not even because of what Gianforte did, although I thought, what in the world? But because I think there was a poll that said 42% of Republicans said that it was okay, basically. That is scary stuff. When I talk about truth over partisanship, this is the part where you have to be a decent human being, folks. Okay, you can still vote for Gianforte and say, with all of that said, it's still a binary choice. You can do that. But at the very least, let's acknowledge that you're not allowed to body slam other human beings. So I think that if people do that, then it's not a big deal. I mean, it's the same way I sort of feel about President Trump. It was one of my main objections to President Trump during the actual election cycle, was this feeling that people were ignoring bad things that he did in order to move him toward victory. And I understand voting for him. I do. I didn't live in a swing state. I live in California. But if I had lived in a swing state, maybe my calculus would have been different. I personally did not vote for either candidate. They didn't earn my vote. But I thought that when it comes to what I was worried about is the corruption of the moral heart of conservatism for temporary victory. And when people say things like, well, it's a civil war, we have to win now, that means all of our principles go out the window. If it's really a civil war, if you really believe it's that grave, then you should be picking up a gun. If it's still a civil society in which we have to have discussions with one another, you cannot approve of people body slamming one another or going to rallies and saying that they're going to pay the legal bills of people who punch other people. You can't do that. And it's okay to vote for that person, but you have to acknowledge that what they did is bad. This is not difficult. You would do the same thing with your own child. You would do the same thing with your friends. You would do the same thing with your boyfriends, your husbands. You would do... and there's not a person that you know who you love, who if they did something wrong, you wouldn't turn to them and say, you know what, you really shouldn't have done that. But we do it with our own politicians all the time. And it's really disturbing, and we need to cut that crap out. Because the more we do that, the worse it's going to get. The more the left is just going to look at us and say, you guys don't even have the moral wherewithal to stand on your own principles, let alone preach principles to us. Remember, we're the moral side. People say, well, why can't we do what the left does? Because we're the good guys, people. Okay, we're not allowed to do what the left does. If they're the black hats in this cowboy story, we're supposed to be wearing the white hats.
Hi, over here.
Okay, sorry about that.
I just want to thank you for being so nice to me back in the meet and greet. It made my trip really special, so thank you for that.
Oh, good. If I'd known who you were, I'd have been so mean. Just mean and nasty and cruel. Yeah.
Anyway, I go to a really liberal college in California, of course, as most of them are. What can I do as a student to make sure that my conservative voice, as well as the other conservative voices, are heard, as well as the other liberal, libertarian voices at my school?
So, I mean, the first thing that I would say is do most of your main lifting outside of class. So the big mistake I think a lot of college students make is they think that I'm going to talk back to the professor, and now I'm a hero. Okay, well, if you talk back to the professor, and then you get a C, then you just handed the professor the baton with which to club you. The point of going to college is to get good grades, make a lot of money, donate a lot of money to the school, and then get the professor fired who would grade people down. So the way that you convince people, I went to UCLA, obviously, for undergrad, and what that meant for me is that I would speak out in class, but we had blue books. I'm sure most people in this room still use blue books. You write anonymously, you have student ID numbers. So what I would do in class is I would mouth off as much as I wanted, and I didn't really care because I would always write like Bernie Sanders in the blue book. And that's how you end up graduating summa cum laude from UCLA as a conservative. But I would always, you have to kind of pick your spots is what I would say. And there are spots where it's more productive, and there are spots where it's less productive. I mean, there are classes where I'd work on other members of my class, and by the end of the class, half the class would be on my side of a particular issue. You can do that, but most of the work you're going to be doing is not going to be arguing with the professor. It's going to be talking with the other students outside your class. This is true in politics generally, by the way. Everybody thinks that it's the people who are in public life talking about politics all the time who convince tons and tons of people. Yeah, we convince lots of people, but the people who convince most of the people are you guys when you go home and talk to your friends. That's how most politics actually works, is on a one-to-one level.
Hello, my name is Olivia Rorich. Thank you so much for coming out here. I really appreciate it. Personally, for me, as a conservative woman, I am against having a tax on feminine hygiene products. However, I've noticed with other fellow conservatives, mostly older generations, they are for having a tax on feminine hygiene products, and I was just wondering, what is your opinion on this?
So my view of this is that there should be a tax on virtually nothing. So I mean, if we're talking about just a broad, if we're talking about just a broad version of let's not tax things as a general rule, I'm with you. If the idea is that we should make an exception for feminine hygiene products, I don't like tax subsidies and loopholes. I think that we should have a basic rule for all products. Either we're going to tax all the products the same, or we're not going to tax any of the products. That seems to me a better rule than trying to pick and choose which products are more important to people and which ones we should give them feedback on, or we should give them money back, or any of that sort of stuff. I'm not a big fan of tax subsidies.
Hi, Ben. Thank you so much for being here. I wrote my question down. So in light of the recent self-inflicted black segregation, such as the Black Lives Matter exclusively Black Memorial Day celebration and separate Black-only Harvard graduation, it seems the left's newest buzzword is culture appropriation. Given the left's abhorrence of said culture appropriation, what do you think of the ever-increasingly common casting of Black people in white roles, the most common example being the Broadway production Hamilton? I personally think it debases the production and makes it historically inaccurate. But when I view this point, I'm referred to as a racist and a bigot, obviously. What are your thoughts on this, and depending on what they are?
So I have many thoughts on Hamilton. I'm a fan of musical theater. I've actually written a couple musicals with my dad. So I'm a big fan of musical theater. I am not a fan of Hamilton, not because of the race of the people who are in it, but because I don't like rap. I think it's garbage. And so that's, but I'm a snob this way. As far as the cultural appropriation thing, I think all cultural appropriation arguments are really, really stupid. I did talk on my podcast at length about Hamilton, and what I did say about Hamilton is I found it kind of insulting, the idea that Black and brown people can only understand the story of Hamilton if you cast Black and brown people in the parts. I find that really insulting. Like when I was growing up, I dressed up, Purim is sort of the Jewish version of Halloween, and on Purim every year I would dress up as John Adams. John Adams is a white Christian male. Right? It never occurred to me, well, I wish that John Adams were a Jew. Like, who cares? He did great things. Right? My daughter is in love with the book that we read at home, and it's one of these little kids' books about Martin Luther King. She loves it. It never occurs to me or to her, well, I really wish Martin Luther King had been white. Like, what kind of stupidity would that be? Right? You're either doing good things or you're doing bad things. So, I am not fond of the notion that you have to cast people in particular roles as a sop to particular crowds. That said, and by the way, the best musical about the founding is not even close to Hamilton. It's 1776, by far. That said, do I think it's a horrible thing if a Black person plays Hamilton? No, I don't think it's a horrible thing, except, as you say, the left makes a huge deal out of any time a white person plays what they think is a Black role, or they go crazy if at University of Missouri, if a white person even wants to protest alongside them. So You should have a very simple standard here, and that is you either care about race or you don't care about race. If you don't care about race, you don't care about race. If you do, you do. End of story.
Okay. Hi, my name is Reagan. I'm a huge fan. I just want to know, what are your thoughts on women being allowed in the special forces?
So my view on women in the special forces is that there is a standard to get in the special forces. If women meet it, they should serve. You know, first of all, I'm not in personally any sort of position to tell anybody who can serve and who didn't. I was not brave enough to do so. So everybody who is serving is braver than I was. So I don't get to talk about that. That said, as a citizen, I do have a stake in the special forces not lowering their standards in order to achieve some sort of affirmative action. So again, so long as a woman is doing all the things that she has to do in order to get in, and that standard has not been lowered deliberately to bring women into the special forces, I really don't see a huge problem with it.
Hello? Hi. Okay. So you spoke a bit at length in your talk about how you should take college as a time to reevaluate your opinions, and I even did that at one point. I used to be pro-choice, and after some of your videos and other things, I'm now staunchly pro-life.
Well, thank you.
And I wanted to ask you, how do you deal with people that say, well, you used to be this, now you're this, you're a flip-flopper, you have no values, and
Yes.
you know, it's hard to reevaluate them and not be, you know, talked down to.
This is one of the most effective arguments of the left, is they tend to accuse people of hypocrisy. It's how they trapped an entire generation of baby boomers into stupidity. Right? They said, oh, you did drugs and you protested against the Vietnam War when you're young, and now here you are and you've changed into a Reaganite. What happened to you? You're such a hypocrite. Okay, there's a word for hypocrisy that we use in this sort of quote-unquote hypocrisy that we use in the religious community, and it's called repentance. Okay, we are capable of recognizing when we've made a mistake, and now there was new evidence that we didn't know about, and we changed our minds based on new evidence. Hypocrisy is not that. Hypocrisy is when you think that there's a standard that applies to everybody else but not you. Hypocrisy is when you say, it's bad for everybody else to commit adultery, but for me,